Thank you very much for the invitation to the department to give the 2025 Bartholomeusz lecture. It is a privilege and honor, and I'm very happy to be here to share some work on something about the little ices that I've been thinking about. So let me begin. Cutting transversely across the picture plane, the Blue River flows beyond the border of the painting to a space elsewhere, a space that is concealed beyond representation. It is the transversal movement of the fleeting diagonal, more than the height of the vertical or the repose of the horizontal, that visually ciphers the precipitous passage of the river Yamuna through Braj, the bucolic site 85 miles south of New Delhi, where the divine Krishna is believed to have spent his youth. As the Yamuna flows 855 miles from the glacial formations of the Himalayas to its confluence with the river Ganga in the city of Allahabad in North India, it meanders through the 144 square mile pilgrimage center of Braj. Exceeding its riverine form, the Yamuna in Braj, however, is the sensual drops of sweat that emerge during Krishna's lovemaking with his devotees. For Krishna's devotees, the Yamuna is ecstatic love in liquid form. Although the river had been deified as an anthropomorphic goddess in the early centuries of the Common Era, it was only in the mid-16th century that a form of water worship emerged in Braj that perceived divine presence not only in anthropomorphic icons, but also in the natural form of the river. Commissioned by a merchant family from the region, the painting on the screen thus illustrates Krishna's play in the river Yamuna with the cowherd women devotees or gopis of Braj. Tired from the pleasures of love, Krishna, who has lost all inhibitions, enters the water of the flowing river with his devotees. Thus begins the Jal Kriya, the water play, as described in the Bhagavad Purana, a text central to 16th century praxis of Krishna worship. With looks of love, the young women around him laughed and splashed him okay. Worshipped with showers of kusuma flowers by the celestial beings in the aerial chariots, Krishna disported himself like an elephant in Lila play, even though he is content within himself. As a visual translation of the verse from the Bhagavad Purana, the folio depicts the bejeweled body of Krishna flowing with a turbulent undercurrent of the river towards an arena beyond the yellow margin that marks the limit of the painting, the limit of representation itself. The artist's deliberate transgression of the bounded borders of the folio has not gone unnoticed in art history. Indeed, the painting in the circa 1516 manuscript, now known as the Isartha Bhagavata Purana, has become, for art historians, exemplary of a new visual language that has emerged in response to pictorial conventions developed in the imperial atelier under the Mughal Emperor Akbar. The innovative use of delicate white lines to demarcate the turbulent waves of water and the disregard for pictorial margins in the manuscript also appear in contemporaneous Mughal paintings produced in the imperial court. One sees a similar mode of depicting the swirling fluidity of flowing water in the history of Hamza, or the Hamzanama, a manuscript commissioned by the Emperor Akbar around 1562. A folio from the manuscript, the one on the screen, depicting the prophet Elias rescuing Hamza's nephew Nurul-Dhar from the sea, makes perceptible both the formal and the psychological potential of water as it was imagined in the Mughal atelier. The delicate strokes of white paint seem to indicate the translucence of cresting wind-driven waves, while sea monsters threaten the doomed protagonist. It is the ungovernable power of menacing water that the Mughal artist apprehends through curved lines, indicating the tempestuous waves of the sea. This fluid vitality of turbulent water was also central to the imagination of the river Yamuna, flowing through Braj in the Isartha manuscript that was produced within a decade of Akbar commissioning the imperial Hamzanama, or history of Hamza. The Isartha manuscript then, understandably, becomes for art historians key in mapping the sweeping transformations in painterly cultures in South Asia that ensued in the 16th century with the establishment of the Mughal Empire. Indeed, a number of folios in the album seems to have used a similar visual strategy, one that was organized around highlighting the aqueous dynamism of flowing water while accentuating the river within the picture plane. Yet, the act of reading this new technique of representing water solely as an outcome of Central Asian Timurid artistic cultures introduced by the Mughals in North India also serves to idealize the landscape as a system of representation that includes linkages between the natural environment and human action upon it. The Sarta Bhagavata then is surely not a closed discourse, significant only for the history of art of the Indian subcontinent. There is another matrix within which I propose we place the representational dynamism of water in the folio, one that is structured around the global flow of water and air. And here I'm referring to what climate historians describe as the Little Ice Age, a period between 1450 and 1850 that witnessed the climate of Western Europe becoming generally harsher when mountain glaciers expanded to their greatest extent due to diminishing solar output, changes in atmospheric circulation, and volcanic activity. In other parts of the world, the Little Ice Age caused greater frequency of droughts. As climate historian John McNeill has observed, in West Africa, the Sahel, that is, the dry frontiers of the Saharan fringe, pushed southward in the 16th and the 17th century, causing a series of droughts. It should be obvious then that the naming of this climatic epoch is at odds with the global history of this period. In central Mexico, for instance, catastrophic droughts of great intensity ensued between 1545 and 1580. Thus, internal to the classification of the Little Ice Age is embedded a peculiar kind of Eurocentricism that both names and designates an entire climatic period in world history based on declining temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere. Yet, with persistent droughts and unstable dry-wet swings brought about by the El Niño Southern Oscillation, the effects of the Little Ice Age in South Asia and parts of Africa and the Americas was distinctly dissonant from that of the Northern Hemisphere. From 1554 onwards, the frequency of droughts had in fact increased in South Asia, with the worst calamity ensuing in the 1630s when 5 million people died. Thus, from a different geo-perspective, the Little Ice Age may well be designated as the Little Drought Age, as environmental historian Georgina Enfield proposed in her study on hydropolitics in central Mexico. My own foray in this so-called Little Ice Age began with my first book, where I first wrote about this painting. The book brought environmental history into dialogue with the vibrant expansion of artistic production in the pilgrimage center of Bruges after the 1500s. The aim was to bear upon questions of art history, arguments that were advanced in early modern climate history, to better rethink the connections among the environment, politics, culture, religion, and art. And since then, I have been continuing my conversation with environmental historians to collaboratively think about the global histories of the Little Ice Age. And I take the liberty today to return to the Little Ice Age, this time through a question that has continued to haunt my thinking about the subject that I could not address in the book. Can terminologies, schemas, and lexica transcend the finitude of their intellectual home? As you all know, the geologist Francois Matthys coined the term Little Ice Age in 1939 to describe glacial advances and retreats during the late Holocene, based upon observations in the Sierra Nevadas. In the 1970s, based on paleoclimatic evidence drawn largely from Europe and North America, climatologists, geographers, and glaciologists contended that the Little Ice Age should more appropriately designate the period between 1450 and 1850, when glaciers in the Northern Hemisphere expanded. But what intellectual traction does the Little Ice Age as a historical period carry globally, given the foundational weight of this period in narratives about capitalism, colonialism, and European modernity? And here I'm referring to a whole range of new books by historians such as Dagmar de Groot, who has read the history of the Dutch Republic through the Little Ice Age, or Sam White's work on colonialism in North America, again through the question of the Little Ice Age. Or can we say that places beyond the Northern Hemisphere leave their imprint on purportedly universal concepts in a way that calls into question the politics of naming and the alleged seamlessness of periodizations? And in the wake of a copious contention regarding the global applications of terms such as Renaissance, modernity, and so on, I want to propose a turn to a more nuanced spatio-temporal scalar thinking in environmental art history. By this, I mean to suggest that localizing climate histories might allow us to avoid the pitfalls of Eurocentricism and hemispheric biases in the ways we think, teach, and write. To return then to the Little Ice Age, or the age of unusual droughts, this time through a 144 square mile pilgrimage center in North India. Although texts such as the late 9th or early 10th century Bhagavata Purana designate Braj as the site where Krishna defeated the serpent Kaliya, slew the demon Keshi, and danced with his devotees, monumental sandstone sculpture excavated in the region, now known as Braj, indicate its importance as a Buddhist center in the early centuries of the Common Era. It was only in the 16th century that an extant artistic vocabulary of Krishna worship materialized in the region. At the time, the region was a cluster of sleepy villages. Most of the monasteries and temples from the early centuries of the Common Era had all been abandoned. Only in the mid-16th century did Braj become a nodal point in an imperial network of trade with the construction of a roadway connecting Delhi and Agra that ran through Braj. And the rest of the roads on the map are from the 18th and the 19th century, except the one that is marked in red. The subsequent escalation of trade led to the development of a rich mercantile center. The 16th century also saw the development of a strong sectarian center of Krishna worship in Braj within this emergent matrix of a mercantile economy. Each of the sects that were active in Braj emphasized a particular aspect of intimate devotion to immerse oneself in the divine. But for our purposes, what is important to note is this. Despite differences, in each instance, the diverse forms of Krishna worship in Braj emphasize the importance of seeing or ritually beholding the topography of the region as key to liturgy. Describing the 16th century making of this sacred landscape, the literary scholar Alan Entwistle writes, from the mid-16th century onwards, the number of sacred places multiplied. Nothing was too trivial for the pioneers of this pilgrimage route. They discovered a location for every canonical episode in the life of Krishna. A sacred association was found for practically every village, pond, tree, or landmark in the district. And for example, this is apparently the precise spot where Krishna drew water. And even today, apparently the water turns white on a certain based on the lunar calendar. Thus, along with the river Yamuna, rocks, trees, and even the dust of Braj came to be considered charged with immanent energy. For us, however, it is important to note that this new liturgy of place materialized during the monsoon failures of the Little Ice Age. Lasting between 1554 and 1556, the first of the droughts, which would continue well into the 18th century, ensued with the failure of monsoon. Writing on the droughts of 1556, the Mughal historian Abul Fazl, Akbar's close companion, noted, and I quote Abul Fazl here, there was a terrible famine in many parts, especially in the province of Delhi. men took to eating each other. Some would join together and carry off a solitary man and make him their food. Describing the drought as Khasam-i-Izad, divine wrath, Badoni, another eyewitness likewise asserted that the scarcity of rain and the shortness of grain led to man eating his fellow man. Now, we know that accounts of cannibalism, really apocalyptic accounts of cannibalism during climate catastrophes abound in early modern narratives. But what is important is that the Mughal taxation records also indicate that the droughts between 1554 and 1556 led to a crisis in the availability of food crops. That the elite of North India too were affected becomes apparent in Abul Fazl's complaint that during the scarcity, his family of 70 could only obtain 2 pounds of grain. And according to Abul Fazl, and I'm quoting him here, which was set to boil in earthenware vessels and the warm water distributed. It is at this point, within 4 years of the 1556 drought, that we see the artists of the Isarda Bhagavata visualizing a system of representing water, the materiality of the river Yamuna, that exceeded a hydrology that disciplines, measures, and subordinates water's geological force. Discovered in the collection of the landed estate, Thekana of Isarda, approximately 60 miles south of Jaipur in contemporary Rajasthan, the manuscript then is undeniably a significant document in the history of painting in South Asia. Produced in the Braj Agra region, the 23 extant folios from the manuscript depict events from Krishna's life, which were narrated in the 10th book of the Bhagavata Purana. Crucially, these paintings, when read alongside liturgy, provide a deeper history of seeing water as a form of beholding that foregrounds the riverscape within a world of affective aesthetics and the large-scale rearrangement of the natural environment that transpired alongside the severe droughts that ensued in the mid-16th century. The natural undoubtedly shaped the artistic. But such a reading would have to proceed with caution. As products of very different dynamisms, the linkages between painting practices and droughts should offer neither a deterministic history of the environment's agency nor a reductionist, non-anthropocentric history of art. Rather, a transversal movement from the optical sensibility made visible in the manuscript to the natural environment and vice versa could perhaps offer a relational feel that foregrounds the political, social, theological, and artistic imperatives of seeing water in an age of unusual droughts. The Isarda manuscript was only one in a series of illustrated manuscripts produced in the region in the 16th century. With over 200 folios, a Bhagavata Purana from Palam, which is now a suburb of Delhi, southwest Delhi, signals towards the larger artistic cultures that had developed in the mercantile worlds of 16th century Delhi, Braj, and Agra. Commissioned by 2 merchants, the Palam Bhagavata provides us with a point of comparison to the Isarda manuscript produced only a few decades later. As one of the earliest known representations of the Bhagavata, illustrations of the Bhagavata Purana, the Palam manuscript can be placed within a specific regional 15th and early 16th century painting tradition that was characterized by the use of monochromatic bands, for example, on the top, the red bands, the backgrounds, the angular figures in silhouette profiles, and compartmentalized units bordered by solid lines. Water occupies a significant place in the folio. In this folio, which also depicts the water play theme, the Jal Kriya theme, we see Krishna with the gopis or the cowherd women of Braj in the river Yamuna. Working with a limited palette of colors, the artist carefully contrasts bands of intense reds and blues to draw the viewer's attention towards the river, which occupies the central place within the picture plane. In the Palam folio, the river Yamuna is depicted in a characteristic 15th and early 16th century basketwork pattern, and that's the term art history use. I wish there was a better term, but artistry talks about it as a basketwork pattern with clearly marked white parallel lines against deep blue water. This technique of mobilizing parallel lines to indicate flowing water, in fact, has a long history in South Asia, one that can be traced back to the 1st century, where again, as we can see, we see the use of turbulent waters marked by flat parallel lines, similar flat lines here. So this is a long history in South Asian visual culture. Now, we don't know if the artists of the Palam manuscript were actually aware of this convention or had even seen Sachi, but what is obvious is that by the 15th century, the passage from stone to paper had already transpired. Take, for example, this late 15th century manuscript illustrating the poet Bilva Mangala's verses praising the young Krishna who is shown lifting the Govardhan hill in Braj to protect the pastoral communities from torrential rain. Notably, the river Yamuna in this folio flows across the lower edge of the painting, mirroring the contours of the hill that the young Krishna lifts. Water, simultaneously threatening and life-saving, is central to the narrative. On the one hand, Krishna shelters Braj from torrential rain that threatens to flood the riverbanks, potentially inundating the villages. On the other hand, it is the river Yamuna, marked by rapid parallel lines, that is the primary water source sustaining the agro-pastoral communities of Braj. While such hydrosocial practices also play an important role in structuring the folio of the Sarda manuscript, the prominence of the river and its role in governing the visual narrative distinguishes this folio. It seems that the artists have deliberately used pictorial configurations to draw the viewer's attention to the blue river with lotuses, blooming creepers facing the waterfront, and frolicking cattle. The blue of Krishna's body blends into the blue water of the river, making it difficult to discern the separation between the river and the divine body. Carefully tilting the picture plane to create a sense of spatial recession, the artist draws the viewer's attention to the Yamuna, which flows diagonally in a wide swath along a central axis and along the surface of the painting. The implication of this visual innovation becomes legible if we compare the two folios. Following pre-16th century conventions, the river in the Palam folio on your left functions like a flat background or a theatrical backdrop in front of which the narrative is played out. While poetic tropes such as the presence of waterfowl and blooming lotuses point towards a shared vocabulary of visualizing the natural environment, the Yamuna's movement from the background to the very center of the picture plane in the Isarda manuscript, it appears, transpired in a matter of 30 years. Conceivably, the compositional and stylistic differences between the two paintings were informed by the new artistic cultures that were introduced by the Mughals in the interim. So the Hamzanama, for instance, was produced after the Palam and before the Isarda. But we may simultaneously correlate this new mid-16th century practice of visualizing water to both the droughts of the Little Ice Age and a new regional theology based on venerating the environment as a manifestation of divine form. As Vallabha, who was a key figure in the establishment of Krishna worship, puts it in a 16th century Sanskrit hymn dedicated to the river Yamuna, through you, all spiritual powers are attained, and Krishna is delighted. You transform the nature of your devotees. For the theologian Vallabha, the Yamuna's material or external form, on the one hand, expanded the liquid sense of water to seep into a multisensorial experience of the natural ecosystem that encompassed sand on the riverbanks that glistened like the lotus feet of Krishna, the song of peacocks, parrots, and swans, and sweet-smelling flowers that adorned the lush forests on the riverbanks. In Vallabha's words, joyously I honor Yamuna, the source of all spiritual power. Her expansive sand shines as bright as the lotus feet of Krishna. Her waters are as fragrant with lovely flowers, from the lush forests on her bank. She bears the radiance of Krishna. The river's internal form, on the other hand, for Vallabha, was the divine goddess who steered pilgrims into the mystical world of Krishna worship, or Krishna love, Krishna devotion. Depicting the Yamuna, paintings in the Sarda Bhagavata too valorize beholding water as a theological aesthetic, a form of non-anthropomorphic hydrolatry. Emerging from the interstices of creative interventions, religious cultures, and extensive environmental transformations, paintings produced in Braj then present us with an opportunity to explore an ideation of an eco-art history or eco-critical art history. In such an ideation, the act of seeing water becomes the crucial link that connects localized liturgical cultures with an expanded trans-territorial arena of water scarcity and drought. Natural form, rising water, changing banks, altering flows, water currents, riparian habitats, is then not just a system of the environment, but an affective text performing a theological function. Within such a configuration, the river is neither a natural given nor purely a construction of human experience. Rather, as non-different from the unmanifest world where Krishna plays eternally, the river is a liminal arena simultaneously manifest, prakata, worldly, and unmanifest, aprakata, or transcendent. Conceivably, it is this theological coterminity of the manifest and the unmanifest, the visible and the invisible, that also led the artists of the Sarda Bhagavata to trace the journey of the river Yamuna diagonally across the picture plane to a place elsewhere, the aprakata, beyond presence and representation. Let us move to a different mediatic arena, to architecture. By the early 17th century, the growing reputation of Braj led to an increase in patronage at the pilgrimage site. The efflorescence of a culture of riparian architecture in this period included the construction of a series of ghats facing the Yamuna. These appear to have further concretized both the metaphysical and the everyday function of the river within a particular hydroaesthetic arrangement. Ghats, or platforms beside water bodies with steps that provide access to the water, are typically built for domestic use, and they're still in use in South Asia. But in pilgrimage sites such as Braj, ghats are also used for liturgical purposes. Given the powerful symbolism of the river Yamuna as the daughter of the sun god Surya, the Vishram Ghat in Mathura, the one on the screen, a town that would become a center for pilgrimage practices in Braj, had functioned as a site for solar worship before the 16th century. Pre-16th century architecture at the Vishram Ghat, however, does not exist anymore. But 16th century pilgrimage manuals assert that this ghat, or bathing platform, was the precise location where Krishna rested after killing his evil uncle Kamsa. Hence the name Vishram Ghat. Vishram literally rest, the ghat of rest. Note that much of the 17th century construction at the Vishram Ghat ensued under the shadow of monsoon failures and associated droughts. From 1613 onwards, the intensity of droughts greatly surpassed the devastations caused by the natural catastrophes of the earlier century that I have discussed so far. Describing the 1613 drought that was followed by a bubonic plague that lasted for 8 years, and incidentally that is the first instance of a bubonic plague in South Asia, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who inherited the throne in 1605 after Akbar's death, writes, "Since it appears from what aged people say and from history books that this illness has never appeared in this province before, the physicians and the learned were asked about their cause. Some say that since there has been two successive dry years with little rain during the monsoon, it has been caused by the putridity of the air, arising from the dryness and lack of rain. Cumulatively, the disasters of these 2 years took a heavy toll, with over 1,000 deaths on a daily basis in Agra, even in 1616. To ward off the effects of this calamity, the Emperor Jahangir establishes hospitals and several North Indian cities with funds from the royal treasury. It is at this juncture that we see the remarkable proliferation of riparian structures in the Vishram Ghat in Mathura, structures that frame the rivers, now no doubt diminishing liquescence. Built by Bir Singh Deo, the ruler of the central Indian kingdom of Orcha, the most prominent construction at the Vishram Ghat was a Tulabhara Torana, a ceremonial archway used as a weighing scale to measure and distribute valuable commodities like grain. The ruler had sponsored the archway that when he weighed himself and donated his weight in gold at the Ghat during pilgrimage to Braj in 1614. This particular archway was of great significance, but not in the way the structures such as this have been conventionally used. From the 6th century onwards, the Sanskrit word Torana has been frequently used in architectural texts to indicate movement or rushing forth. To forge forward, the word Torana suggests, requires a spatial configuring of a rite of passage through architecture. As an architectural device, Toranas can be seen in both Buddhist and Hindu contexts from the early centuries of the Common Era. The movement through the Torana would, in the context of a temple or a stupa like Sachi, denote a movement from the profane to the sacred, as an embodied practice of transforming oneself provisionally. At the Vishram Ghat, the Torana, however, functioned as a device of enframement. The flowing Yamuna could be viewed through the Torana, while the river simultaneously framed the architectural device. Is the object of art history, then, the view of water and the frame and ideation of human intention and purpose bordering the view? Or is the object of art history the Torana, framed by an imagination of expansive water and the natural environment? As an optical arrangement, the frame is hardly ever insignificant. Rather, as part of a representational whole, the frame most often operates as a generative space connecting the interior to the exterior and the internal to the external. Just as the river exceeds the frame of the Isarda folio, the view of water from the Torana is neither fully internal nor completely external to its frame. Bir Singh's Torana then underscores a different relation between flowing water, sacred space, and vision. Operative here is a possible mode of seeing in which the view of water is framed by the archway, and water, in turn, frames architecture, conjoining the frame and the object through a theological schema. The function of the frame in artistic praxis has been most powerfully articulated by Alberti in his 1435 text on painting. According to Italian artist, philosopher, architect, according to Alberti, it was the frame that set the object of representation apart from what lay beyond it. While art history has revisited over and again the conundrum of the frame as an architectural arrangement that measures, regulates the fictional space of representation, and eco-critical art history might perhaps offer an ideation of the frame that does not remain simply outside of the work, acting from the sidelines, next to the work. And here, of course, I'm referring to Derrida's reflections on the Paragon. The horizontal movement of the effervescent waters of the river Yamuna, we might then concede, produced a waterscape that shaped a very different system of spatial boundaries. How might we account for the liquescent materiality of a substance that is constantly in flow? Should we begin by discerning stable architectural and representational forms that frame, contain, or conversely transmit the fluidity of water? Or must we situate the material shape of water in movement itself? Might we dwell on the swirling materiality of water as immanent to its very mobility and capacity to flow, as the painters of the Isarda folio seems to have done? Insofar as architecture is concerned, the 11th century architectural text, Samarangana Sutradhara, the architect of human dwelling, described the form of the freestanding Torana as a symbol of a monarch's royal benevolence, a description that is corroborated by portals for the distribution of wealth in Hampi, the 16th century capital of the Vijayanagara Empire in South India. The Emperor Akbar, the Mughal Emperor Akbar too, had transformed this recognized state ritual with deep historical roots into an imperial Mughal spectacle. And the emperor might have used this square podium with a canopy and flanking Toranas in his capital in Fatehpur Sikri, just a few miles from Mathura, for this royal celebration. Described in the mid-17th century history of Shah Jahan, the Shah Jahan-Nama, as the celebration of weight, Jasan-i-Wazan, Akbar, it seems, weighed himself twice a year and distributed the wealth in charity. Subsequent emperors had continued this practice, giving the custom imperial Mughal authority. The Torana on the Vishram Ghat was a cognizant attempt on part of the ruler of Orcha, Bir Singh Deo, to both incorporate Mughal architecture into the sacred riverfront of Braj and espouse the political significance of the ritual dispensation of wealth as a form of royal munificence. The use of red sandstone, now painted bright yellow, along with the mobilization of Mughal motifs, for example, the lotus-shaped finials, the distinctive hanging pattern or chain and bell pattern, and rosettes in semi-lotus forms and diamond shapes, certainly takes us back to the architectonics of Mughal architecture, imperial Mughal architecture. While evidence points to artisans from west coast of India, Gujarat, being employed in the construction of Akbar's capital in Fatehpur Sikri, we are yet to find sources to uncover the history of the artisanal praxis in Braj. Thus, we don't know if the artists who actually worked in the Mughal capital were then employed to build the Torana in Braj, but a certain comparison of the ornamentation of the 1614 Torana in the Vishram Ghat and the palaces of Fatehpur Sikri, or Mughal palace of Fatehpur Sikri, suggests that both structures were undoubtedly constructed keeping a similar architectural paradigm in sight. Thus, even while early 17th century Braj was built on sites made sacred through Krishna's primordial inhabitants, the discursive frameworks that structured the optical experience of this space was a Mughal palace complex. The reason for such a citation is not difficult to understand. After all, the Bir Singh's rise in the 17th century was premised on the close political alliance that he shared with the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. At the same time, the floriated arch with a scrolling vine and lotus with aquatic makaras or mythic creatures like elephant-headed creatures place the Vishram Ghat Torana in a long history of water cosmologies that emphasize creative abundance associated with plentiful water in a time of great droughts. Yet, unlike the emblematic function of the Torana as a passage from the profane to the sacred, the structure on the Vishram Ghat did not allow for a ritualistic transformation that could transpire with bodily movement through the portal. Put differently, given the sacrality of the topography of Braj in its totality, the Torana did not demarcate spatial distinction between the sacred and the non-sacred. Instead, the sole function of the archway, at least for pilgrims visiting the site, was to behold the river as it was framed by architecture and to see architecture as the river framed it. Moving away from the ritual architectonics of passage, the structure then generated a spatial intersection between sight, the act of seeing, and sight, the pilgrimage site, in the process creating a different relation between water and space in an age of unusual drought. Even today, pilgrims approach the water, but not by passing through the portal. And it is in this unfeasibility of an object-frame binary operative here that an eco-critical art history emerges, one that in this instances joins the frame and the object, architecture and the natural environment. Perhaps this vision-centric ideation mirrored theological developments in the region. These are most aptly surmised in a passage from a 1541 text, Haribhakti Vilasa, where it discusses the function of the river Yamuna in Braj. The river Saraswati purifies oneself after 3 days. The river Narmada purifies one after 7 weeks. The Ganga purifies one immediately. Yamuna purifies one who beholds it. Even as pre-16th century sacramental norms mandated haptic and gustatory absorption, that is, bathing at a pilgrimage site or drinking the water with which an icon has been washed, charanamrita, as primary forms of ritual engagements with sacred water, the Haribhakti Vilasa demarcates a hierarchy of sacred rivers centered on the privileging of seeing, of vision. Given that these foundational texts were being composed in Braj in the mid-16th century, one could then link the vision of the river Yamuna in text and artistic cultures in diverse ways. So how much time do I have? I'm like, I suddenly realized the paper is longer than I thought.
Yeah.
5, 10?
Sure.
Okay. Thinking transversely, there are 2 points to be emphasized here. The first relates to the history and historiography of South Asian art and religious studies. For the deliberate attempt by Krishna devotees in the 16th and 17th century to rehearse intimate association with Mughal artistic cultures demands a re-engagement with the political cultural histories of a paradigm that Marshall Hodgson had designated as the Islamicate in the 1970s. That is, the social and cultural complex historically associated with Islam and the Muslims, both among Muslims themselves and even when found among non-Muslims. And more recently, art historians and scholars of religion have explored the Islamicate in South Asia by looking at non-Muslim art, architecture, even sartorial cultures, to make visible a shared sociability code of conduct. In a similar vein, when we look at the manuscript or the riparian structure that I discussed today, they too offer a testament to the Islamicate aesthetics that permeated the land of Krishna from its very establishment in the 16th century. And today, this history has an added resonance, for in 1992, the world watched in horror as members of the Hindu nationalist organizations congregated in the North Indian pilgrimage town of Ayodhya in response to a call to liberate the purported site of God Rama's birth. Rama, the Hindu nationalist claimed, was born at this site, on which stood the Babri Mosque, and where a temple had been desecrated in 1528 by a noble in the Mughal Emperor Babur's court. When thus presented, the Babri Mosque became the material embodiment of past Muslim violence against Hindus, the mark of an allegedly threatened Hindu majority. The image of right-wing activists atop the mosque's crumbling structure remains a haunting symbol of Hindu right-wing victory and the public denunciation of earlier post-colonial ideals of a secularist nationalism. We have now come full circle, for a temple has been inaugurated with great pomp and ceremony at this very site. The desecration is part of the current government's attempt to erase all traces of the Mughals from the public sphere, attempts at renaming sites, the toppling of monuments, rewriting history, censorship of dissenting voices. In the face of state-sponsored tyranny on minority communities, my excavation of an Islamic history of a Hindu pilgrimage site, a site not coincidentally fundamental to conservative Hindu right-wing discourses, then reaches for a possible politics beyond the binaries of a fixed self-other paradigm that the Hindu right has so carefully marked out. It is in a terrain where the self and the other cannot be distinguished, when a Muslim palace and a Hindu pilgrimage site are imbricated, where messy histories render difficult, easy understandings of either Hinduism or Islam, that we find a politics of plurality. This on the one hand. On the other hand, the river Yamuna, love in liquid form, is now officially dead. Acknowledged by the Government of India's Central Pollution Control Board in the 2000s as the most polluted river in India, the Yamuna is now deemed fit only for irrigation and industrial cooling, ruling out the possibility of either human consumption or aquatic life. As the river flows through the industrial belts of North India, untreated domestic and industrial effluents are discharged into the water, converting the Yamuna into a river of death. It is this absent river, heavy with toxic effluents, that prompts a reassessment of the Little Ice Age, not as an era of falling temperature, but of water scarcities and monsoon failures. Excavating the engagement between matter and life in Braj then recovers an ecological art history of a non-European world that takes us beyond totalizing social, technological, and political arrangements that were moved to a specific post-16th century global consciousness that commenced with European colonial expansionism under the shadow of the Little Ice Age. Think Dutch Republic and its global empire. It must nonetheless be admitted that the glacialization and falling temperatures in the northern hemisphere and the El Nino southern oscillation-induced droughts in other parts of the world were interconnected by the North Atlantic Oscillation, that is the fluctuation in the atmospheric pressure at sea level between Iceland and the Azores. Negotiating the particularities of contextual history with the traction of the global flow of air and water, I then propose, allows for a recovery of polyphonic entanglements that do not conceive of a uniform and homogenizing planetary totality. Eco-art history, I propose in turn, demands that we take the natural environment as constitutive rather than emblematic or just a symbol. Our story of shape-shifting water then fundamentally departs from older histories of art and architecture that took the environment as a symbol, a metaphor, or even an inspiration. Instead, foregrounding linkages among climate change during the so-called Little Ice Age, the representational registers of painting, and the ocularity of architecture generates a different history of art. But what does it mean to see water when we bring together the connections between climate change and artistic practices? While at the first glance it might seem unfeasible, even incongruous, to relate mythopoetic narratives and art and architecture that memorialize effervescent rivers to the vagaries of climate history, an eco-critical art history can become operative only when the history of art and architecture bring together and reconcile phenomenology with the matter that constituted the natural environment. Such a gesture can have significant implications on how we engage with the materiality of religion, in the process problematizing the purported rift between nature and culture, which, as we know, was an invention of a Westernist rationality that emerged in 17th and 18th century European natural philosophy. This is not to suggest that the pre-enlightened world or early modern South Asia was one in which the human species lived in harmony with the natural environment. Rather, the methodologies of an eco-critical art history might allow us to rethink water as not just material that leads to art histories of trade, production, and technology, but as material imbued with agency and caught up in processual flows. It is in the conjoining of material and materiality, the physical and the phenomenological, that water becomes more than itself. Water, aligned differently, becomes effervescent matter with the potential to unravel the ostensible dichotomies between nature and culture that haunt our anthropogenic present. In such a maneuver, transversality via Guattari could perhaps provide a deeper history of artistic practices that centralize the act of seeing water in an age of unusual droughts. The transversal lines of the river Yamuna that runs across the Esarda folio can then become a site to explore a more capacious history of art, one that is open to the interweaving of the human and the ecological. As Tim Ingold puts it, ecology, in short, is the study of the life of light. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sugata, for that wonderful talk. We have time for some questions, so I'll turn the lights up.
This is so good. I'm grateful to Liz and Sonia for inviting me here because this is really helped me understand a bunch of things and inspired me to think a little bit more creatively about some of the stuff that I do. And so this is so ambitious and creative and thoughtful, and I think it's such a great example of the way you've deployed a kind of eco-critical perspective on visual culture in a way that helps illuminate this kind of funny collaboration that's going on now between people who have always thought themselves as critical geographers and people who are interested in environmental history, and those who study ideology, but particularly religion. And I'm not going to give a long speech before I get to my question, but I have to set it up just for a moment, if you don't mind. And so there's this kind of moment that we're in right now, in which we're trying to wean ourselves off of what was an addiction to notions of the social construction of space. And critical geographers, again, and the nascent spatial humanities has been urging this project to take seriously physical geography as a kind of collaborator with ideology in the makings of these kinds of artifacts, whether they're something matter of art or architecture, or whether they're more complicated artifacts. But my question is this. This is a really difficult project, and it's really hard to figure out how you can start with this dyad. On the one side, you have the insistence upon the importance of physical geography, and especially in your case, the history of the physical geography, which you center as climate. And then, of course, all of the centuries of religious constructions of the meanings of these important environmental events that take place. And one has to juggle these sorts of things in trying to figure out what you're supposed to make of an artifact such as this in appreciating both sides of it. So my question, sorry for taking so long, my question is, in getting to this, how do you manage that, And I ask this very specifically because the temptation, of course, is, to try to swing the other direction and to try to, cross out a lot of the backgrounds of argument of the social construction of space in order to make room for the real embodied reality of physical geography. And you have to, exercise a certain kind of caution and not overreaching again in the other direction, so that while we're escaping the social constructionist view, we're not overly embracing a kind of physical geography view. So my question is this: when you do this kind of work, do you rely much upon the testimony of the individuals who live this in trying to form a kind of standpoint by which you can negotiate agreement between ideological and geographic, in terms of physical geographic evidences?
No, thank you. That's a wonderful question, and something that I am struggling with, and I am actually having massive arguments with environmental historians who work on what we now call the global north, which has this intensity of archives in terms of not just written records or narratives, but also land grants and climate histories. So literally, I just I published an essay on a book which is mostly on the global north and in terms of climate resilience in the early modern period, and they kept asking me for empirical evidence that these droughts happen.
Right.
And I was like, I don't have empirical evidence, and that is the problem of working beyond Europe and not what is now called the US and Canada. There is no empirical evidence, so I latch on to every testament that I get, whether it's Badoni or whether it's Abul Fazl. But we also have to remember that these are representations, right, in a certain way. When Abul Fazl is talking about cannibalism, I mean, it's also a certain way of thinking about climate. And I think one has to read these texts transversely or read the text against their grain to get a better sense of what were the climatic transformations happening in this period. So is that what you, the question was about people in this period and their accounts, right, if I am correct?
Yeah, I mean, of course it's so difficult, especially when you're working back a number of centuries, to try to sort out what might be the relatively raw physical experiences of people as they walk around the world looking at the river through the pilgrims' pillars there, and what is actually available to us in records, which have massaged those into terms that are compatible with the ideological biases of, in this case, maybe a combination of both Mughal and Hindu influences.
So I think the trick for me was to actually look at sources or archives that typically an art historian or a scholar of religion wouldn't do. That is, looking at a lot of work being produced from the sciences. So my data on climate was actually coming from scientists who were doing pollen analysis. I do not have any example from Braj, but I do have from Rajasthan, which is around 30 miles. So that, in a way, allowed me to actually bring together representation, both visual, textual, and architecture, along with a climate history that is more recognizable within environmental history, that actually looks at pollen analysis, looks at data from snow, ice cores to actually map historical evidence. So I think especially if one has to bring these two domains, one is the domain of creativity, whether we talk about religion or art, and the domain of economics and actual historical climatic processes, the source or the archives have to be interdisciplinary. Otherwise, it's a very difficult task to actually bring these two bodies of scholarship in conversation.
Of course, yeah. Well, in another life, we'll have time to talk about this.
Other questions? Yeah. Oh. Matthew and then Mark.
Thank you. I enjoyed this, and I have a question about this image, and it's kind of like I like what you're saying about this makes a lot of sense. That sort of that the emphasis on water takes on a new relevance if we sort of understand it in the context of like scarcity of water. And I really liked the emphasis on sort of this, as Christian, this conflation between the water and the divine body of Krishna. And so, in that context, I have a very simple question about this image, and it's based on my own ignorance of the tradition. But I guess my question is sort of. So traditionally, I understand that traditionally Krishna is understood as blue, but why, I'm not actually sure. Is there an older connection between Krishna and water that you find like they're kind of adapting, or is it sort of like reconnecting the sort of the sense of his color to this new sense of water? I don't know the mythic background behind that, but sort of I'm thinking about the blueness of Krishna sort of fitting with what you're doing here.
So those who work on the pre-16th century Vaishnavism, scholars have argued that Krishna actually emerges from a tribal god. The blue is actually a signifier of his dark skin. So it's rather than water, it's more a racial signifier. And so he was a herds person. So he comes from an agro-pastoral community, and originally he was of dark skin. And so even texts from the 1st century onwards would describe his skin as dark blue. And I think it's an interesting question that we sort of then move to thinking about water, but I don't think in the 1st century at least, the signification of skin and race was marked through the liquescence of water. But by this time, you barely can see Krishna because the river and the god's body are actually almost merging.
Yeah, that's what I mean, where the blueness of the water fits with the blueness of Krishna. Yeah, in the image.
If I actually might just follow up on that, because I had a related question. I'm also struck by the kind of intervisibility between the water and Krishna. And of course, Krishna has dark skin, but we also know through his various kind of epic activities that he's also dark in the sense that he is obscure. He can be kind of underhanded. He works kind of behind the scenes in different ways. And he's also kind of obscure in the sense that he's often inaccessible to his devotees. So he's an object of desire, this kind of embodied desire that's never fully realized, or that's always kind of something that the devotees and the gopis are kind of constantly seeking to grasp onto. And so I wonder then if there's any connection between that kind of idea of Krishna being opaque, being unattainable, being an object of kind of physical desire or thirst, and then the connections with this kind of age of unusual drought, and the desire for water, and then the seemingly like unbounded water that flows across the page, and is also, like Krishna, sort of something that the viewer desires, but yet can never really attain or have.
No, I think it's a wonderful way of thinking about it. When I was writing on this painting, I was actually thinking about the way in which, obviously from David Haberman's work, thinking about how the body of the god and the body of the river are actually almost merging, and it's actually happening in theological texts precisely at this point. But I think you can absolutely push it further and then think about, because it's also the Yamuna. I mean, again, this is where the whole lack of archives hinders us.
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't have data the way one has for Antwerp or London in terms of like the height of the river or how much of the river flow at this point. We have wonderful archives for the Thames and other rivers in European cities. So I do not even know how much the Yamuna was affected, how far did it go down, how far did it go up, and these would be the interesting questions in terms of trying to think about the relationship with the tangible, physical river that's flowing through the thing and the representation of the river. And I think there is something about this idea of the physically that is not manifest and that which is manifest. And of course, for me, what is interesting is to bring in the question of climate here, because that is, again, scholars of Vaishnavism have written about this for centuries, decades. So it's not a new argument to say that the river is present or absent, or how does one talk about the history of the river. For me, is that when I look at this and histories of art, so art historians have written on this, we've never thought about the actual river. We've always thought this as a representational register. But I think once you bring climate into the story, there has to be a relationship between representation and what's out there. And that for me was that was what for me was the interest that drew me to this painting. But I think there's something one could push further theologically to think about.
Yeah, and I think it works perfectly with the climate idea in the sense that both the water and Krishna have become kind of intense objects of physical desire, right? And they're kind of
So I talk about it as a limited commodity. So I wrote an essay on water, but yes, Krishna is also a limited commodity.
Just a very quick question to ask you to say a little bit more about the theology. So when I understand the divine as an object of desire, I understand the desire to be near it, right? So building the riparian structures, let's say. And yet there's also a tradition that comes to mind that when the divine is represented as sublime, that one keeps one's distance from it. And I'm thinking about slightly secularized versions of that story in the history of national parks in this country, for example, right? That one doesn't build. So I'm wondering whether you could say something more about the relationship between a theology based on desire and building in that way. That one wants to, and a theology that leads to expressions of architectural expressions of proximity, I guess. If that makes sense.
That's a very interesting question. So, but if you go back to the national parks in North America, the swamp was not a national park. It's precisely mountains. So in a way, if you think about the Yamuna, texts talk about it as a bucolic landscape, but it's pretty urban in the 16th century.
Yeah.
So for me, what is interesting is that the whole debate on the sublime was always pinned in Yellowstone or Niagara Falls or Yosemite. So it was always about the theory of sublime required us to go to this experience, to this space, and feel humbled before it, right? If you think about how sublime then I think in a way plays into some church architecture, I would argue. But I think the difference here is that the modality of devotion is far more intimate, and the word used is bhakti, literally devotion. So I think if I had to do it within a South Asian context, and it's sort of historically inaccurate to do it, but if I had to find a corollary, I would say the sublime would play out in the Himalayas. I mean, again, I haven't worked on the Himalayas, but I would say that if I'm using sort of the theory of the sublime as it's developed in the 18th century, and then it's moved to my backyard in California with John Muir and all that, it's actually based on an experience of rugged landscapes where one feels very small. So I would say there is where natural topography matters. This is a river that's pretty much like running through a very urban center. So that subliminal experience that one would feel would perhaps be in Mount Kailash. Again, this mythical abode of God Shiva. But I am not sure if anyone has used that particular trajectory, intellectual history of the sublime, which has its own routes in colonialism and the movement of indigenous communities from these regions, and how that leads to a history of Nepal, Tibet, and how Hinduism is shaped there. I'm sure that it's a way of thinking about sublime and such colonialism in those regions as well.
Yeah, so I was really interested in the motif of sight, because the place where you began and end was this idea of seeing water. So the limited work that I've done on art and religion has been around the moral and political significance of art and the way that religious traditions and other traditions take it up. So sight, of course, in the archives that I work in, is linked to desire, the lust of the eyes. It also has a close connection to understanding. It's a motif. Language is often used for knowledge or understanding, partly because sight is connected so strongly to affect. It moves ideology, and has really profound political significance. So visual culture, like you were gesturing towards in the erasure of movement culture, that's powerful, because what can be seen has a profound political power. So the thing I wondered when you were speaking of the importance of seeing water is, in the vision of eco-art history that you have and in the traditions that you're drawing upon, does the quality of sight matter, or is it the fact of sight? So you referred to this really interesting text that says that River Yamuna purifies the one who sees it. Does it matter how the person sees it, or is the mere perception purifying in that tradition that you're drawing on? And then, sort of broadly, in your vision of eco-art history, does the way that we see water matter, or is it simply the sight of it that has significance? Does the quality of sight matter in your understanding of seeing?
Quality of sight. That's very interesting question. So again, I think my response would be based on if the quality of. Are you thinking about the quality of sight empirically or philosophically? Because the quality of sight also matters empirically in the way that what can you actually see.
Sure.
So I think those two aspects have different histories as I would see it. One is, I was recently in Lahore when the AQI went over 1500, I could see nothing. So there is that history of sight, and it's important for someone interested in climate, it's an important question in terms of what can you actually see. And how do you recover that history? And that is another question. I mean, except what we experience, how do you recover how much of that river could actually be seen? And I can't. I have tried. There is no way I can recover until the river is dredged and I actually can go and see where the lines are, which I will not be allowed to do. So there is no way I can actually trace an empirical history of sight in that sense. But I do think that's an important question, especially if you want to bring together the question of the act of seeing and climate, because what we see is based on the atmospheric in a certain way. Now, philosophically, there is always this particular form of Krishna worship as it emerged in the 16th century, as his scholars of religion would argue, was fundamentally based on the act of sight. And it's not this text, there's a poet like Mira who's also talking about seeing Krishna. So seeing the Lord becomes a way of devotional sublimation. So there is a certain theory of seeing that is philosophical, and typically scholars have seen, except someone like David Haberman would typically talk about the icon or the imagination of an embodied presence of the God or the divine body, and it's very few scholars, including me, have argued that we also have to talk about seeing the environment or seeing the topography of the region. But that is a philosophical question of what does it mean to see a rock, a mountain, a tree, a river. Now, in an ideal world, that philosophical history of sight should be related to a history, an empirical history of sort of a history of vision, a theory of vision, which I cannot do because I don't have the archives. But in some other parts of the world where there are better archives, maybe it's a good question to bring together the philosophical question of sight and sort of the history of vision and see how do you bring those two together? Are there changes in theories of vision based on how much smog there is in London in the 19th century? Does it change today when the AQI goes up and down? What does it mean to see a sacred site? Does it change? So again, as someone who's working on the 16th century in North India, I do not have the archives to do that interesting work. But I think it's a fascinating question, is that can climate change and atmospheric conditions based on smog, based on today's industrial pollutants, transform our understanding of seeing through a theological schema? Is that what sort of was, I didn't know this.
Any final questions? No, I said, Arya, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that talk. I was actually interested about your point about the nature-culture divide and how it's something that you think about in your work, and I'm fascinated by it because I also am learning more about it for my dissertation. So I was wondering how your ideas of water as this entangled space, how do you carry that idea into also your new work on animals as in the Mughal period or paintings in the Mughal period? How do you see this South Asian view of this entangled nature culture, if there is any?
I would hesitate to call it a South Asian view. I would historically, like even the way I would say Krishna worship is articulated in this site is different from other sites in the South Asian, in the Indian subcontinent. But in a simple way to answer the question, in my new book project, I'm interested in thinking about historical animals. Because if you think about both religious studies and art history, we've always seen the animal as a symbol, right? As a metaphor, as an icon, or a symbol. But what does it mean to relate, like, in a way, going back to this question of sight and sight, is that how do you account for, what does the elephant mean as a symbol, and how do you relate the history of the elephant and its extinction in many parts of Asia? Can we bring those together? For me, so that's where one thinks about nature culture entanglement, is precisely thinking about animals or plants or natural formations as historical actors, and to bring together these two different ways of thinking about the environment. One which is part of, from the 19th century, there's a long history of thinking about symbolism and iconography and how we talk about plants, animals, nature, and all that. And then there is a sort of environmental history. And in a way, for me, bringing those two together, so looking at, let's say, the one chapter that I just finished was looking at a historical Turkey that arrived on a certain day at a certain point in India in March 25th, 1612. So Turkey, whereas your scholars working on Turkeys in North America, in Europe, would see the Turkey as a symbol of European colonialism, as sort of an allegory of European colonialism. So for me, like, actually bringing historical actors as a way of thinking about this nature-culture divide, and not just seeing the animal or the plant as merely an allegorical symbol of a certain religious idea or a cultural idea.
Well, join me in thanking Sugata again.